Hi, my name is Megan McGrath, and I completed my research thesis for my master's degree with my supervisor, Ms. Connie Williams, concerning the impact of music, dance, and improvisation to promote valued social communication outcomes for individuals with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities. What you see before you now is my poster project with all of the information available to you concerning this project. And what I will do now is break down each specific section to discuss them further. The background of this study was taken from um, my undergraduate research thesis conducted at the Pennsylvania State University and completed in the year 2019 upon my graduation. What that study sought to understand was how specifically these mechanisms or tools were used to impact social communication, as many studies have looked at how dance, music, theater, and improvisation can impact social communication for special populations. Our study sought to understand specifically what aspects and what characteristics of this sort of setting and these sort of activities were meaningful to promoting that change. What this study sought to do was expand on that first study, knowing that what we had achieved and accomplished through creating a code book um, taken from student reflections, identifying commonalities in theme and major mechanisms for change, as well as their subparts and specific examples of that. That study was taking the perspective of the typically developing peers after conversation with their peers with intellectual or developmental disabilities, and were written only from the perspective of those typically developing peers. And while this information is very useful and found great overlap and commonalities in theme and understanding, what this study sought to do was understand from the perspective of the individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities themselves. The goal of this study was to understand how these people specifically felt that theater, music, dance, and improvisation impacted their lives, and to compare those reflections to that was analyzed in the previous study. This study involved individuals of similar groups, although not exactly the same, and could have had overlap with participants. It was a smaller group due to time and availability restrictions, but the data nonetheless is still relevant to the same study. The diagram you see before you now is the theme diagram that was created in association with the code book from the previous study. So as you can see, the main mechanisms for change found in the previous study were that of safety, of comfortability and confidence, movement and creativity, which then led to application outcomes or generalizability throughout other experiences beyond just musical theater and performance arts. You will see more of these specific codes in more depth later on in the presentation. However, this is a very clear diagram to demonstrate exactly what these tools were and how they fed each other and established change. So this study was conducted a bit differently than the previous study, both due to COVID restrictions and location restrictions as well. This study was conducted in a focus group style via Zoom, and the participants were recruited from familiar performance groups in the area around Penn State, as well as in areas around the Pittsburgh area as well. There were 3 groups which were reached out to enlist participants, and participants were informed that they needed to be 18 years of age or older and have a diagnosis of an intellectual or developmental disability, as well as previous musical experience. 6 participants were recruited, with 2 females and 4 males. And then a date was established for this meeting. Unfortunately, one participant was unable to attend due to conflicts with the time, and another participant did not attend without a notable reason. And so the final participant count was 4, with 2 females, and 2 males. The focus group lasted approximately an hour and 15 minutes and was held by an individual unfamiliar to the participants as well as to the methods of the class previously discussed. The focus group was guided for conversation concerning impact of musical performance as well as skills learned to gather a very well-rounded perspective. And the guiding question for this study and for the overall questions within the focus group was that of if individuals with developmental or intellectual disabilities identified the same mechanisms for change or outcomes in themselves as their typically developing peers when using musical performance and improvisation as a tool for learning. So comparing the initial study results to this study results and that of the typically developing peers to the intellectual or developmentally disabled peers. Upon completion of the focus group, the recorded sample was transcribed to text and de-identified by identity of gender or name before given to the lead researcher for analysis to help minimize any kind of bias. The analysis followed a similar pattern to the research previously discussed in that each blurb of conversation was broken apart and using the current code book created in the previous study to identify if each spoken conversational anecdote fit with the current code book or did not and required a new code. The head researcher and the research supervisor both completed these activities, and there was a comparison of results to determine accuracy and saturation among the codes. With conversational coding and collaborative coding beyond the individual analysis, we were able to reach 90% saturation with only 2 outstanding codes for which we could not fully agree. And so due to that high degree of saturation and consistency among coders, one familiar with the code book as the lead researcher and one unfamiliar with the code book as the research supervisor, this was promising information, and there were identified 3 instances in which responses did not fit the current code book, but would still be relevant to add or amend or consider. What you see before you now are the list of questions provided to the facilitator of the conversation during the focus group. While not all questions were specifically asked, these were the guiding principles for which the conversation developed. What you see before you now is the initial code book. These are the aspects of safety previously discussed in terms of environment and expectations, safety with time, and safety with group and peer reinforcement. Safety led to the willingness and comfortability to feel creative, both within a structure and within oneself or individuality. Creativity promoted confidence, and the willingness to understand the role of movement and how to move your body, both with physical aspects and interpersonal skills. And this was a cyclical nature that in turn led to applications or generalization outside of the therapy setting. As you can see, we identified individual factors, partnership factors, and then contextual factors. And as noted, this is the code book previously created from which we were working to analyze if there were similarities or differences in the responses that were achieved during this study. So now we move on to results. The focus group identified many of the same themes and subthemes. In the main poster, you'll be able to see the arrows indicating the mentioned subthemes, all of which were mentioned at least once aside from one within the scope of role of movement. This was very promising to support the current code book as is, and to say that it was substantially confirmed and supported through this study. There were 3 outstanding codes which did not fit within the sub themes identified, but did fit within the overall themes, that of safety, creativity, role of movement, and applications. So we will look at these specific subcodes now as they were relevant to expanding the knowledge that already existed, and important to consider in future studies as well. This first quote you can see was provided by one of the participants. And as you read it, you will understand that while this quote doesn't fit with the current application subthemes, it does fit under the overall umbrella context of applications or generalization beyond the theater context. So this code would identify a new subtheme beyond partnership factors that is already existing to that of teamwork and collaboration. The previous study identified partnership factors in the context of how to understand your partner, how to react to your partner, and things like that. But this quote goes beyond to identify the importance of teamwork and collaboration in knowing your role and knowing their role and when to adapt and modify and thus forth. This next quote again fits under the umbrella of applications as the main theme, but would involve a new sub-theme of multitasking, a skill that this individual found went beyond their theater experience and into their everyday life and accomplishments. Finally, this is the third code that did not fit in with the current code book. It still, again, is within the realm of applications or outcomes, but this code discusses the future aspirations and goals, something that was not touched on in the previous study, but is relevant to this study. Oftentimes, it's very difficult to accommodate and teach and understand abstract thinking through the scope of an individual with intellectual or developmental disability. And this shows a higher level of learning and information processing as it is a high level skill, to be able to understand how to reach and achieve a future goal, both within the short term and the long term. So, from the data and the research that we were able to complete during this study, we found quite a bit of support for the current codebook, which is affirming the previous study and those findings. And it is very important to note that they were taken from 2 different populations. So, that consistency is key to understanding how and why musical theater and improvisation can impact social communication. Those 3 subthemes that newly were identified under the scope of applications were meaningful to the context of the overall study in that they identified new subthemes that were meaningful to the individuals themselves with intellectual or developmental disabilities and things they were able to self-reflect on. This was a challenge or a potential issue for this study in that self-reflection is not typically a strength identified with with special populations, but was not something that these individuals struggled with. And to be identifying such higher level learning skills and processes was very meaningful, and should absolutely be discussed in further studies. It's also important to note that in the last year and a half, the coronavirus has been present. And so this has been difficult to complete these groups and participate in these performance groups in the same context. And so a lot of these groups have been moved to online settings via Zoom, and to be confirmed that that safety in the teamwork or in your peers was seen throughout, regardless of the fact that it was not in person, and that there was not that physical support, was very important. I believe that often coincided with the theme of safety, and especially the idea of variable expectations. So being able to do what you were most comfortable with. I cannot speak to how this would have impacted someone who has not previously participated in a theater group, as this wasn't one of the requirements for the current participants, but it seems that as they have felt comfortable and confident throughout their experiences before, when it was in person, then transitioning to online due to the coronavirus has not had a negative impact or really any impact on any of those mechanisms for change noted. So, this study overall was very meaningful in that it confirmed the research findings previously achieved in the 2019 study at Penn State. It also expanded the study in those three new applications, which should absolutely be developed further. And there could be more research warranted to the impact of a telecommunication or a online forum within the scope of theater, as that is something newly developing. Overall, more research is warranted regarding the specific areas of performance and how they can support what specific social communication skills or higher level learning, but thus far the data is promising. Um, for more resources and information, you can refer to any of the following. And the research study that I previously completed at Pennsylvania State University is published in their library as well. So again, this is my overall poster. I hope that this was a meaningful conversation for you in trying to understand how specifically musical performance and improvisation could be used as a tool or a research avenue or a clinical avenue to pursuing and expanding on social communication skills for special populations. Thank you for your time.